Europe likes clean answers, clear origins, a neat family tree. 3 ancestors, we're told: hunters, farmers, steppe riders. Mix them, and Europe is born. But the Balkans refuse to fit, because when scientists began pulling DNA from ancient bones buried in this land, something felt wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. The numbers didn't behave, the patterns didn't settle, the genes kept pointing elsewhere. South, east, deeper. The Balkans didn't look like the rest of Europe, and the more you zoomed in, the stranger it became. This region sat inside the Roman world for centuries. Roman cities rose here. Roman law ruled here. Latin echoed through streets and markets. History tells us that Rome shaped everything it touched, so the expectation was simple: Roman culture in the soil, Roman blood in the bones. But the DNA tells a quieter, more unsettling story. Ancient genomes from the first millennium show people living under Roman rule who were not Roman at all, not genetically, not biologically. Their ancestry didn't trace back to Italy. It didn't even lean heavily toward Western Europe. Instead, their DNA whispered older truths. Anatolia, the Eastern Mediterranean, deep Balkan lineages that had already been here long before Rome arrived. Rome ruled the surface, but it never replaced the people. And that changes everything. Because if the most powerful empire in Europe could conquer land without changing its blood, then how many other histories are built on illusion? How many identities were reshaped by language, religion, and law, while the DNA stayed quietly the same? This is where the story turns personal, because this isn't just about the Balkans, it's about belonging. What if the story you inherited, about where your people come from, was written by power, not biology? What if your ancestors survived by blending, adapting, staying invisible, while history praised the conquerors? The Balkans are not Europe's edge. They are Europe's crack, a place where neat narratives collapse, where ancestry refuses to obey borders, where identity becomes layered, uncomfortable, unresolved. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because if these people weren't Roman, and not fully what we now call European, then who were they? Who laid the genetic foundation of this land? Who stayed when empires fell? Who came before history learned how to write their names? To find them, we can't stay here. We can't stay in Roman times. We can't even stay in Europe. We have to go back further. Before empires, before borders, before Europe knew what it was. And once we do, the story becomes far more dangerous. Before Rome, before emperors, armies, and borders. This land was already crowded with history. The Balkans were never empty ground waiting to be claimed. They were already a meeting place, quiet, ancient, alive with movement, but not the kind written in books, the kind carried in blood. More than 9,000 years ago, people were already here. Hunter-gatherers, small groups moving through forests and rivers, shaping stone, following seasons. Their lives were hard, fragile, but deeply rooted. For thousands of years, they were the Balkans. Then something new arrived. From across the Aegean, from Anatolia, people began to move, slowly at first. Families, not armies. They didn't come with weapons. They came with seeds, animals. A different idea of living. Farming. It sounds simple now. Almost boring. But back then, it was a biological earthquake. These early farmers didn't just change how food was grown. They changed who survived, they settled, they multiplied, they lived closer together. And as they spread into Southeast Europe, they didn't erase the locals, but they absorbed them. Bones from this period tell a quiet, uncomfortable truth. The DNA shifts fast. Within a few centuries, the genetic balance changes. Hunter-gatherer ancestry fades, farmer ancestry rises. Not because of violence, but because farming reshaped life itself. This is the first deep layer of Balkan DNA, and it's different. Unlike Western Europe, where these farmers later mixed heavily with other groups, the Balkans kept a stronger connection to this early Anatolian world, a genetic base that tied the region southward, not westward. This wasn't just a change in diet, it was a rewiring of ancestry. Stone tools give way to permanent homes. Seasonal movement gives way to villages. Burial rituals change, family structures change, and echoes of this shift still survive. In folk traditions, in rhythms of rural life, in customs that feel older than memory. The Balkans were already becoming something unique. Not European in the way we imagine today. Not Asian. Not anything clean or singular. A blend. A crossroads. A foundation laid long before history learned how to name it. But this balance didn't last. Because while these early farmers were settling in, while this new genetic core was forming, another force was already moving far beyond the horizon. One that wouldn't arrive with seeds, but with speed, animals, and a completely different way of seeing the world. And when it came, it wouldn't gently merge. It would reshuffle everything. It didn't come with plows. It didn't arrive quietly. It came on hooves. Long after the first farmers settled the land, long after villages took root, something else began to move across the open spaces beyond the Balkans. Not cities, not empires. People who lived with animals, followed grasslands, and measured distance differently. The steppe. For a long time, they existed only as legend. Horse lords, nomads, shadows at the edge of history. But DNA doesn't believe in myths. And when scientists traced ancient genomes from the Bronze Age, the signal appeared. Clear, persistent, impossible to ignore. These people didn't just pass through. They entered the Balkans, not once, not in a single wave, but again and again. The first traces arrive early, thousands of years before medieval history ever begins. Small at first, almost subtle. A few percent here, a little more there. But over centuries, the pattern grows stronger. Like a slow tide. If you could see it from above, it wouldn't look like an invasion. It would look like colors spreading across a map. Genetic heat rising and falling. Steppe ancestry flowing into valleys, mixing with farmer blood, reshaping communities without erasing them. These were not faceless conquerors. They married, they settled, they stayed, they brought new animals, new tools, new ways of moving through the world. And slowly, quietly, their DNA fused with what was already here. This is the part that unsettles people. Because the steppe wasn't a myth, and it wasn't temporary. Its genetic echo still lives inside the Balkans today, in proportions that rise and fall depending on region, elevation, and history. In patterns that refuse to match neat timelines. And, suddenly, the Balkans start to look different again. Not just a bridge between Anatolia and Europe, but a place where radically different worlds overlapped. Farmers and nomads, settlers and riders, permanence and movement. No single group replaced the other. They layered, and that layering matters. Because this wasn't the final form. This wasn't the end of the story. What the steppe brought was not just ancestry, it was momentum. A proof that large-scale movement could reshape the region without destroying it. A precedent, something learned, something repeated. And centuries later, when the world began to collapse again, when empires weakened, borders dissolved, and people started moving in numbers never seen before, the Balkans were already prepared. What came next would not be subtle. It would not be slow. This was only the rehearsal. Rome arrived loudly. Roads cut through mountains. Cities rose where villages once stood. Stone replaced wood. Latin replaced local tongues. Law replaced tradition. From the outside, it looked complete, total, unquestionable. So for a long time, everyone assumed the same thing, that Rome didn't just rule the Balkans, it replaced them. But when scientists finally looked inside Roman-era graves, the story collapsed. Because the DNA didn't match the empire. Ancient genomes from people who lived and died under Roman rule show almost no Italic ancestry. Not the kind you would expect after 4 centuries of control. Not the genetic footprint of colonists pouring in from Italy. Instead, the biological core stayed stubbornly local. This is where the illusion breaks. Rome spread power, not people. Language, not lineage. Culture, not chromosomes. Roman law shaped daily life. Roman gods filled temples. Roman names filled inscriptions. But beneath all of it, the same families kept burying their dead in the same soil, generation after generation. And something even stranger appears. Under Roman rule, Eastern ancestries don't disappear. They persist. Anatolian lineages remain strong. Mediterranean connections deepen. Even distant origins quietly enter the gene pool, not through conquest, but through trade, movement, and integration. Rome didn't overwrite the Balkans. It sat on top of them. That's the uncomfortable truth. Because it means identity can change without replacement. A population can speak a new language, follow new laws, live inside a new empire, while remaining biologically continuous. And that should make you uneasy. If Rome couldn't change the genes, then how many other Roman identities were just surface transformations? How many people history labels as something new were, in reality, something far older? The Balkans absorbed Rome without becoming Roman. They adapted, they endured, they waited, and when the empire finally weakened, when roads cracked, cities emptied, and authority faded, the people didn't vanish. They were still there. Which leads to a far more dangerous question. If Rome didn't reshape the genes, if centuries of empire barely moved the needle, then who did? Because the next change wouldn't be subtle, it wouldn't be gradual, and it wouldn't come dressed in marble and law. It would come with movement, with numbers, with families on the road. And once it began, the Balkans would never be the same again. You've heard the story before. Slavs moved in, languages changed, history turned a page. But that version skips the most important question. What DNA actually moved with them? When ancient genomes from the Balkans were finally lined up, grave by grave, century by century, the answer was impossible to soften. Around the 6th century, something massive begins to happen. Not slowly, not symbolically, biologically. A new genetic signal surges in from the northeast. At first, it looks like a ripple. A few individuals, a few villages. But then the pattern accelerates. Within generations, entire regions begin to shift. The old balance, Anatolian farmers, steppe layers, Roman-era continuity, starts to tilt. This wasn't elite rule. This wasn't a thin ruling class. This was people, men and women, families, children, communities arriving and staying. The DNA shows it clearly. In some Balkan populations, this migration contributes 30, 40, even 60% of modern ancestry. That's not influence, that's foundation. You can almost see it happen. Imagine valleys that once held Roman towns and older villages. Now, new settlements appear, new burial customs, new rhythms of life, and beneath it all, the genetic colors change, like a tide rolling inland from Eastern Europe. This is where culture and biology lock together. Languages spread because people spread. Songs survive because families survive. Traditions endure because bloodlines endure. The Slavic migrations didn't just rename the Balkans, they rewired them. And this is the moment many modern identities are born. Not in myths, not in medieval chronicles, but in real bodies, real marriages, real generations stacking on top of one another. But here's where the story refuses to stay simple. Because the DNA doesn't show a clean takeover. It shows variation. Some regions absorb more, others less. Some valleys change fast, others resist. Older Balkan lineages don't disappear, they blend. Maternal lines persist. Local ancestry holds on in quiet ways. This wasn't one wave, it wasn't one people, it wasn't one outcome. It was layered, messy, uneven. And that matters. Because if the Slavic impact itself isn't uniform, if it looks different from place to place, then the idea of a single Slavic identity starts to crack. What arrived in the Balkans wasn't a block, it was a process. And once you see that, you start to wonder what else is hiding inside this migration. Because the Slavs didn't arrive on empty land. They didn't replace a single people. They stepped into a genetic mosaic already thousands of years old. Which raises the next, more dangerous question. If the Slavic wave reshaped the Balkans so deeply, why didn't it erase what came before? And what exactly survived underneath it? What if everything you used to define yourself is only half the story. Language feels permanent. It feels inherited. It feels like proof. If your grandparents spoke it, if your village sings in it, if your history is written in it, then it must be who you are. But DNA doesn't care about language. And in the Balkans, the two often tell different stories. After the Slavic migrations, something unexpected happens. Slavic languages spread wide and fast, covering regions that were once Roman, Greek, or something far older. On the surface, it looks like replacement. A clean shift. A new people taking over. But beneath the words, the genes resist that simplicity. Ancient and modern DNA show a pattern of blending, not erasure. In many places, the biological signal stays mixed. Older Balkan, ancestry doesn't vanish. It persists, quietly threaded through new generations. And the clearest clue comes from mothers. Again and again, genetic studies reveal the same thing. While male lineages often reflect incoming groups, maternal lines remain deeply local. Women didn't disappear, families didn't collapse. Instead, new identities formed inside old households. Assimilation, not annihilation. This is how identity actually changes, not by wiping the slate clean, but by layering something new on top of what already exists. And once you see this pattern, it appears everywhere. Take the Gagars. They speak a Turkic language. Their traditions point east. On paper, their origins seem clear. But their DNA tells a different story, one that ties them more closely to their Balkan neighbors than to distant Turkic homelands. Language traveled. People mostly didn't. This is the trap of history. It teaches us to follow words, flags, and names, but genes move differently. They cross boundaries slowly. They linger. They remember. Which means identity is not a straight line. It's a weave. Threads from ancient farmers, threads from steppe riders, threads from Slavic families, all crossing, overlapping, tightening with time. So when someone asks, "Who are you really?" the answer is never simple. Because if your language says one thing and your DNA says another, which one do you believe? And once that question is asked, it doesn't stop here. Because beneath even these blended identities, there are deeper layers, older than Slavs, older than Rome, still alive, still measurable, still shaping the present. The real question now isn't who arrived, it's who never left. Beneath every migration we've talked about, beneath every empire, every language shift, every rewritten identity, there is something older still, a core. Long before Slavs arrived, long before Rome marched in, before horse riders crossed the plains, the Balkans already had people with names history barely remembers now. Illyrians, Thracians, Paleo-Balkan societies that lived, buried their dead, raised families, and built worlds without ever knowing they would be labeled pre-something. For centuries, historians assumed they disappeared, conquered, absorbed, lost. But DNA tells a different story. When researchers compared Iron Age remains with modern Balkan genomes, they found continuity. Not perfect, not untouched, but undeniable. Threads that stretch across 2,000 years without breaking. These ancient people didn't vanish, they blended. Even after invasions, even after cultural upheaval, their genetic signal remains, especially in maternal and autosomal DNA. Mothers passed it on. Families carried it forward. Quietly. Persistently. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because survival doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just continues. You can feel it in the cultural echoes. Burial customs that repeat ancient patterns. Mourning rituals that don't belong to Rome or Slavs or later religions, but something deeper, something local, something old. These traditions didn't survive because they were written down. They survived because people lived them, generation after generation. So when we talk about Balkan identity, we're not talking about replacement. We're talking about fusion. Ancient foundations holding up new structures, even as names and languages change above them. This is what DNA makes impossible to ignore. The Balkans are not a sequence of peoples arriving and disappearing. They are a layering of survival. And once you accept that, the story becomes far more unsettling. Because if these Paleo-Balkan voices still speak through modern bloodlines, if their presence is measurable, real, alive, then how many other ancient identities are still hiding inside us, misnamed, misunderstood, waiting? How many stories are buried so deep that only DNA can hear them? And what happens? When we dig even further, past the Iron Age, past the labels, into the oldest layers still untouched. Because the ground hasn't given up all its secrets yet. Forget the idea of a single origin. In the Balkans, that idea collapses the moment you look closely. What lives here is not a straight line of ancestry, but a quilt, stitched together over thousands of years, piece by piece, migration by migration. Anatolian farmers at the base, steppe riders layered on top, Roman-era blends along the frontier, Slavic waves reshaping the surface, and beneath it all, the Paleo-Balkan core still holding. None of these layers erased the others. They stacked. That's why Balkan DNA looks different when you place it next to Western or Northern Europe. There, the genetic story simplifies faster. Fewer layers, clearer breaks, more uniform outcomes. Here, it never settles. Instead, the genome keeps its memory. Southern signals remain stronger. Eastern ties stay visible. Even when culture shifts, the biology refuses to flatten into a single pattern. This is where the discomfort begins. Because when scientists compare Balkan genomes to those from Germany, Scandinavia, or Britain, the contrast is obvious. The Balkans don't cluster neatly with the core of Europe. They sit between worlds, pulling toward the Aegean, the Caucasus, West Asia, not because they're less European, but because European was never a single thing to begin with. Identity here isn't inherited like a surname. It's accumulated. Every generation adds something. Every migration leaves a trace. Every survival carries memory forward. And that makes ancestry feel less like a destination, and more like a story that never stopped being written. This is why borders fail in the Balkans. Why categories feel unstable. Why history keeps arguing with itself. The DNA is doing exactly what the land always did, connecting worlds. And once you see that, the question changes. It's no longer, where do we come from? It becomes, why did we expect one answer? Because if the Balkans are this layered, this connected, this unresolved, then what does that say about Europe as a whole? If this region can't be boxed into a simple category, maybe the category itself is wrong. And if that's true, then the very idea of European DNA is standing on shaky ground. What happens when the stories we tell about ourselves collide with evidence that doesn't care how we feel? Because DNA doesn't negotiate. It doesn't flatter nations. It doesn't protect myths. Across the Balkans, genetic results have done something uncomfortable. They've contradicted origin stories people grew up believing. Stories about being purely one thing, one people, one line stretching cleanly back through time. Instead, the results come back mixed, unexpected, sometimes deeply personal. A village that believes it descends from ancient warriors, only to discover strong farmer ancestry. From Anatolia. A community certain it arrived in the Middle Ages, only to carry maternal lines thousands of years older. A nation convinced of isolation, suddenly linked, genetically, to neighbors it once defined itself against. This is where ancestry stops being abstract. Because belonging isn't just about data, it's about meaning. When DNA challenges identity, the reaction isn't curiosity first, it's discomfort. Resistance, even anger. Not because the science is wrong, but because it forces a question people aren't ready to ask. Who are we, really? Genetic research across the Balkans shows the same truth repeating over and over. No population here is the product of a single moment. Every genome is layered. Ancient farmers, steppe ancestry, Paleo-Balkan continuity, Slavic migrations, Roman-era movement. All present, all measurable. Millennia didn't erase what came before. They added to it. You can imagine it like chains, links of DNA stretching across time. A. Grandmother connected to a Bronze Age burial. A modern face tied, invisibly, to Iron Age hands. not as symbols, but as biology. This is why simple answers fail. Because ancestry isn't a clean handover from one people to the next. It's interruption and survival happening at the same time. Loss and persistence intertwined. And once that sinks in, something changes. Identity stops being about purity. It becomes about continuity. Not who replaced whom, but who endured, adapted, and carried pieces forward. Still, the tension doesn't disappear. If our genes reveal constant mixing, if every origin story fractures under scrutiny, then what are we actually inheriting? Are we the result of disruption, waves breaking what came before, or are we evidence of something else entirely? A deep, stubborn continuity that outlives every label history invents, because the DNA isn't finished speaking yet. And the final answer, about who we are and what ancestry truly means, may be the most unsettling part of the story. The Balkans have already rewritten history once, and that alone should make us uneasy, because every time scientists thought the story was finished, the DNA disagreed. New graves, new sequences, new contradictions. What felt settled suddenly wasn't. What felt proven began to shift. Ancient genomes don't confirm history, they challenge it. And the most unsettling part is this: what we've uncovered so far may only be the surface. Right now, researchers are no longer asking broad questions. They're going smaller, sharper, micro-regions, single valleys, individual cemeteries, even family groups buried side by side. Not just who lived here, but who lived with whom, married whom, raised children together. DNA is starting to reveal relationships, parents, siblings, lineages stretching across centuries. And with finer timelines, something dangerous happens. Events we thought were single migrations fracture into phases. Movements we assumed were sudden turn out to be slow. Identities we labeled as fixed begin to blur at the edges. The Balkans don't simplify when you zoom in. They become more complex. This is where ancestry stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a mirror. Not reflecting certainty, but possibility. Every answer creates two new questions. Every discovery opens a deeper silence. Connections emerge across Eurasia. Threads linking the Balkans to Anatolia, the Caucasus, the steppe, the Mediterranean. Not as arrows on a map, but as shared bloodlines, shared pasts, shared human decisions. And somewhere beneath the soil, more stories are waiting. Graves that haven't been opened, bones that haven't been sampled, genomes that will disrupt everything we think we know, again. Because the next discovery won't just add a detail, it will force another rewrite. And when it does, it won't ask for permission. It won't care about identity. It won't respect borders or beliefs. It will simply speak. And when it does, the Balkans may once again remind us that history was never finished, only paused, waiting to be uncovered.